started. And Dr. Donaldson is a member of the faculty here, and she's wonderful. She's really, really smart about autism. And but this is a topic that she has a lot of knowledge on, deaf culture. So, Dr. Donaldson.
All right, hello. I'm actually not going to sign because when you sign and speak at the same time, that's called simultaneous communication, and it's not actually really language, right? What I'm doing if I'm trying to sign and speak at the same time is I'm signing using English grammar. And a friend of mine who is hard of hearing, he once described it so well. He said, you know, watching someone simcom is like having someone speaking English and every once in a while shouting Japanese at you. Because you can't do two languages at the same time. One of them has to compromise, right? So that's why I want to say thank you, first of all, to our interpreters today to be here to interpret. And so I can not be shouting Japanese while I'm speaking English. And I want to thank my husband, Corey Swigert, for coming today. So that leads us to why we're here. He's a member of the deaf community and part of deaf culture, and so he can monitor what I tell you and make sure it's accurate. But I'll tell you a little bit more about my background so you can understand what we're going to talk about today. But before I do that, I also want to thank Heather for videotaping for us today for some folks who had some class conflicts and they can't be here. So welcome. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to be talking about this topic. Some of you may know me from, as Boone said, my area of research and definitely my passion, which is autism spectrum disorder and looking at social communication skills. And many people don't know that I'm also very passionate about deaf culture and the deaf community and American Sign Language. And we haven't had as many opportunities in this department to talk about this, and I'm pretty committed to doing so. And I'll tell you why as we move through. So why can I be here talking to you? Most of the time, when we talk about deafness, it should be coming from a deaf person, right? Because that's firsthand perspective. And I won't force Corey to stand up here and talk with you about it because that's not something that you know, he enjoys doing necessarily. So I'm kind of being the surrogate here. But I do feel like I have the credentials, so to speak, to be able to speak to this. So I did my undergraduate degree at Washington State University, and then I had never actually met a deaf person, never encountered deaf culture, had taken a couple ASL courses, and let me tell you guys, I probably was the only person in the history of ASL Level 2 to get a B, because I ditched all the time. And then I would just meet up with my pal the night before an exam, and he would like teach me really quickly. So it's incredibly ironic that I ended up at Gallaudet University for my master's degree. And Gallaudet University is the only liberal arts deaf university in the entire world. And so all undergraduates are deaf or hard of hearing, and all, I would say about 50–40% of graduate students are deaf or hard of hearing. But I slid in the other percentile for the graduate students who could be hearing. And I was really naive, and actually that was a saving grace, as I'll explain, because I got there thinking, awesome, this is going to be like that, going in a foreign country. And let me tell you, it was. It was absolutely a foreign country and a deaf world. And it was the most humbling, most awesome, most wonderful experience of my life. And so I did my master's degree in speech language pathology at Gallaudet University and met my husband. And we have 2 children who are bilingual in American Sign Language and spoken English. And we view deafness, and the deaf community views deafness, as a cultural and linguistic minority, not a disability group. And this is one of the reasons why I'm compelled to speak with you, particularly in our discipline, speech and hearing sciences, because I would say 99% of our discipline views deafness from a pathological or medical view. And that is, we need to fix it, we need to cure it, something's wrong, people must be devastated if they have a child with deafness. And guess what? That's not the case. There's a whole community that we're going to talk about today, but that's not the case for. So when you go to Gallaudet, it is a deaf world, and every interaction is an ASL, and every friendship that you make revolves around deaf culture. And so you can imagine how well the person who did the ASL course fared when I first got there. So it's in Washington, D.C., and I fly across the country, and I've got my bags, and I walk in the door on the first day, and I set my bags down, and I'm like, okay, I'm here. Like, my name, me, awesome, okay, so, and someone's like, okay, yeah, I get it, it's a deaf university, but okay, now where's the hearing person I can talk to about my dorm room? And it was like, as I said, the most humbling experience I've ever had. And so I learned very quickly, and I made a commitment to myself, I could go to any university in the country for my master's degree. I made the conscious choice to go to Gallaudet University, and if I'm going to go there, then I'm absolutely going to take in everything I can about this incredibly unique environment. And there were many humbling and discouraging interactions, as well as enlightening and loving interactions that happened there. Because again, my naivety, as I said, served me well. I didn't know that speech language pathology and audiology weren't very well liked in the deaf community. I mean, Corey and his contemporaries were of the age where your hands were tied behind your back to practice speaking, or you practiced listening by completely blocking your mouth to a profoundly deaf person. So, wow, that was eye-opening to me. And so one of the things that was a saving grace is that I wasn't quick and ready with like a defense. I just sat and listened and was like, oh my gosh, really? Wow, that's kind of crazy. I'm happy it doesn't happen anymore. Yet, to the degree some things like that still happen when we're teaching deaf kids to speak or to listen. So it was really great for me to get to hear kind of these unguarded experiences of my colleagues and my friends without automatically being defensive that I had to defend my discipline or my hearing status. Because I'm a hearing person. That's never going to change. But I have a deaf culture perspective from as a hearing community member. So anyway, that's who I am. That's why I'm here talking today. I feel really committed to the notion that actually our disciplines have a really great role to play in the deaf community. I came out of my master's degree and served children who were deaf and hard of hearing in what I consider to be functional communication skills. Because let's face facts, people who are deaf are in a hearing world, right? So I worked in Oakland Public Schools with their deaf and hard of hearing program, middle school and high school, and I had some kids like 13 years of age who had never ordered for themselves in a restaurant. We did a field trip to McDonald's, folks. You point to the picture, you pay your money, okay? Because there's no reason that a 13-year-old should be dependent on someone else to order a Big Mac, right? Or my high school students, we worked on resumes and did some mock interviews and how they could do strategies around talking with people who are going to predominantly be spoken English speakers and not know anything about deaf culture or ASL. And I'll never forget, after I was doing this for a while, an interpreter actually in the high school program came running up to me in the parking lot one day and he's like, oh, this is awesome. Amy, who gave you permission to do this? I've been wanting to do this kind of stuff forever. And I just said, oh, I didn't ask anyone's permission. I mean, this is what these folks need to learn. And so I view us as a discipline having, as I said, a fundamental role in helping understand how environmental factors or promoting self-independence or self-advocacy can play a role in deaf community members who seek that out. And there will be those who don't. Okay? So we talked about what deaf culture is in terms of our view that differs from a medical or pathological view. But it really is, as any culture is, a group of social beliefs, behaviors, traditions, values, and shared institutions. And it really ties most readily around American Sign Language. That is probably the #1 priority in the deaf community. And you can understand this as as speech, language, and hearing professionals, because language is the bond that holds a community together, right? And so we need to think about that when we think about how we interact with the deaf community, and the notion that a integrated or mainstream classroom for that 8-year-old who has hearing loss, who uses ASL, may not be the best, most appropriate, or least restrictive environment for that child. Does that make sense? You know, I know from personal experience, I've had friends who were mainstreamed, and their best friend was their interpreter, right? So, you know, you've got an 8-year-old in a class, and their 24-year-old interpreter is the only person that they interact with. So that's not least restrictive. What's the difference between capital D deaf and deaf? You may see that sometimes. Well, capital D deaf just really signifies it's a group of people who share their language, ASL, and a culture. Whereas a lowercase d refers to an individual with hearing loss. And I would say most often, people who identify with hearing culture self-identify themselves as hearing impaired. Okay, so my grandfather, he worked with printing presses his entire life. And by the time I got to know him as a young child, he already used amplification. He was constantly saying to my grandma, "What? What did she say, Alice?" You know, he would never learn a sign in his life because it wasn't appropriate for him. My grandma's name was Alice. And so he is someone that might self-identify as hearing impaired, okay? But the deaf community does not identify as hearing impaired. And we're going to talk about that distinction in a minute. So when you're talking about just someone with hearing loss, you're talking about the physical status of their hearing. Whereas when you talk about someone who's a deaf community member, and this is something that's a little bit hard for people to wrap their brain around sometimes, it has nothing to do with your level of hearing acuity. It is a cultural distinction. So people have asked me before, well, how deaf is your husband? I have no idea, he's deaf. Last audiogram was probably in middle school. I don't know, I'm looking for confirmation. Yeah, probably. Because you don't ask a member of the African American community, well, how black are you? Or a member of the Jewish community, well, how Jewish are you? You know, it's a cultural community distinction. It has nothing to do with, and really no one would even think to try to measure how deaf someone is. Having said that, within the deaf community, some people who use spoken English on a regular basis, as well as maybe benefit from amplification in like a job, may refer to themselves as hard of hearing, okay? But they still have an identity that's involved with deaf culture because their primary language is ASL, okay? All right. So we already talked about the notion that American Sign Language is the top cultural value of the deaf community. For that reason, so there's an interesting thing called the 90-90 phenomenon. 90% of deaf children have hearing parents, and 90% of deaf parents have hearing children. So think about that for a second. Might be a little too warm and a little too sunny to kind of do that conversion, right? What we're talking about then is that many, many deaf children are not growing up in a language environment that is an ASL language environment, unless that family has committed to learning ASL. And then completely, as we would with any child, exposing them and surrounding them with language opportunities in the language that they use. So for that reason, residential schools are incredibly important. There's a residential school in every state. Some states have 2. California has California School for the Deaf Fremont as well as Riverside. And for many children, going to a residential school where it is the deaf community, ASL is used in their classrooms, is the very first time that they've been surrounded by people who use their language and share their community and culture. It is incredibly valuable and precious to deaf community members. And so any legislative push towards closing or restricting residential schools is really resisted strongly by the deaf community, because for many folks that I know, the first time they ever saw a teacher who used their language, they were 5 years old, you know? The first time they ever had a best friend who they could communicate, they were 6 years old, right? Imagine how that is, particularly what we know about early language development, right? Okay. Gallaudet University is very much an icon of the deaf community. As I said, it's the only liberal arts deaf university in the world, and it attracts deaf individuals from around the world. And so going to Gallaudet, you are immersed in the deaf community and deaf culture. And for me as a hearing person, again, I had to kind of welcome that with an open heart, because that is truly the only place in the United States where a deaf person can go and have full expectation that everyone around them is sharing their culture and their language. So in my first year there, I actually fell down the stairs and broke my ankle. So I was on crutches, and we were walking, my friend and I were walking back from the cafeteria to our dorm, and you know, and I was on crutches, so I was using both my hands, and so I happened to just be speaking to her. And a deaf person came up and said, "Hey, what's up with your friend? She doesn't know ASL?" And I had to stop and be like, "No, I'm actually on crutches." But it was awesome, because we actually went and sat, and I chatted with that individual for like the next hour. We talked about hearing people on a deaf campus and what that means, and the fact that my ASL still wasn't strong, and what was I doing, and all of these things. And he had every right to come up and ask me that. Every right to come up and ask me that, because this is the only place, again, in the United States, that there is an expectation that everyone there shares your culture and your language. And believe me, that caused a lot of nervousness and anxiety for me. I mean, I can still remember, as I was just learning ASL, walking to the post office and being like, because I'd already been there once before and I wasn't successful in buying stamps. So I kind of went back to my dorm room, regrouped, and I was like, I want stamps, I want stamps, I want stamps, please. And literally on the walk from like my dorm to the post office, which was, Gallaudet's a rather small campus, but it's still a fair distance, I'm like, please don't see anyone you know. Please don't see anyone you know, because I was so worried I was going to lose it. I was going to lose the I want stamps. And then I get to the post office and be unsuccessful yet again, right? Or the cafeteria, the same thing, because I'll never forget the day I was in line and I ordered a grilled chocolate. And the guy behind the counter was like, "What? I don't know what that is. What are you doing?" And the person next to me took pity on me and was very kind. "You know she wants a grilled cheese, come on." But, I mean, sometimes that was frustrating for me, and certainly it was humbling, but I never got angry about it, because it just pushed me to better fit the community I had self-selected to become part of, right? So I made a commitment that anytime I learned a new sign, I used it 3 times that day. So fitting kangaroo into the conversation 3 times during the day, or anything, was a little tricky sometimes, but it was well worth it, because there were people actually in my program who didn't make that commitment, and then they struggled. And to me, I kind of thought, well, why didn't you go somewhere else then? You know? One of my closest friends and my roommate, and I love her to death, but there's, in Rochester, New York, there's a methodology in the deaf community to just finger spell a ton of things. So, like, you hear about the Rochester method, and people are just like finger spelling a lot, and then they have signs in there, but it's a lot of finger spelling. And so we kind of started joking, my roommate, because, you know, Corey was so patient, but like after the 5th time of teaching her like bread, because she would be finger spelling, I really want bread and peanut butter. You're like, oh, come on, bread. So making a commitment to that within a very intense master's degree program, which was the only program on campus, by the way, that was taught solely in spoken English, because all of the graduate students were hearing, and a lot of the terminology would have just been finger spelling. So you had to make this extra commitment. So any interaction you had in learning ASL came outside of the classroom, okay? But it was worth it. And then for older deaf individuals, deaf events and clubs are really a way to get together. So there's something that, you know, every community kind of has its identifiers and its jokes around it. One of the things that's a identifier in the deaf culture is super long goodbyes or super long hellos. And so if you go to a deaf party, first of all, it's a fallacy that it's quiet. You can hear a deaf party from like 3 blocks away, let me tell you. That bass is like kicking like you can't even imagine, okay? But second of all, like you could be in a house, just a regular sized house, and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna leave now. And you say goodbye to your friend who's right there, and like an hour and a half later, they see you at that side of the house, and you're like, okay, see you later. Because you're like saying goodbye to each of these people, right? Well, there's a reason for it. There's an absolute reason for it. Because unless you live in a place like DC, or the Bay Area in California, or Rochester, or Riverside, or somewhere that has a very large deaf community, the time that you are surrounded by people who speak your language and are part of your community can be very few and far between. And so deaf clubs are usually a monthly opportunity, particularly for older deaf people, to get together and just talk about their lives and share, which we do every day and we kind of take for granted in the hearing world. Okay? We already talked about the notion that the deaf community views themselves as a cultural, and I would add to that, and linguistic minority, not a disability group. But communication, even if you don't know ASL, is really valued too. So here's an example. My husband really designed and then built a house with my father. And my father is hearing and doesn't know ASL. He's got these really big fingers. And so when he even tries to fingerspell, you're like, at least I am. Corey always gets it. In fact, my dad will just like fingerspell the first 3 and then he just wiggles his fingers and Corey's already guessed what it is. So, but the thing about it is it's valued because every once in a while they ask me to interpret. In fact, I was just sharing with the interpreters that, you know, my husband's in architecture and I'm a researcher and a scientist, so like our brains are very different. And I can't conceptually explain things in ASL about building structure or the 3D aspects of a room. I can't do it at all. So they very rarely ask me to interpret. But even if that wasn't the case, they communicated with each other through emails, through, in that day, faxes, through my dad struggling to fingerspell and Corey guessing what he was saying. So that's what's valued. So I say that because if you encounter a deaf person, don't be like, you know, don't flee. Any attempt to communication is valued. Any attempt at communication is valued. And hey, writing is always a good tool, right? And then all things visual. So here's some exemplars of deaf art. One of them is a mask made by a student at California School for the Deaf, Fremont. And a lot of deaf art has a theme of deafness or the deaf community or deaf culture. And so the quote written by this individual was, "One ear is covered with a metal plate. I can't hear. I put a zipper on my mouth and the hand in the wave is pulling it shut. The water represents silence and the need to use sign language. Well, my larger than normal eyes are happy when I see sign language." Okay? So that's very much a theme that we would see in the deaf community. Chuck Baird is a very well-known deaf artist. And it's a little hard to see with the lighting in this room, but what he's actually showing, the light shows the path of the sign, and he's signing art or draw. Okay? Oh, good. Thanks, Boone. Other deaf artists, deaf individuals are directors of films. They're painters. They're dancers. So, you know, some of the preconceived notions we may have about the deaf community is that, you know, people don't dance or they don't enjoy music or theater or things like that. One of our good friends, actually a groomsman in our wedding, was a performer for the National Theater for the Deaf. And let me tell you, their performances are some of the most amazing performances I've ever seen in my entire life. They did Alice in Wonderland one year. And they had like this, I don't even know, a 20-foot caterpillar.
Right.
Yeah. And so they're all on this caterpillar, and the caterpillar is what the audience sees, right? And it's all of these sets of hands, these actors. But think about that, and so they're like signing simultaneously, or like signing in, you know, like concurrently. Think about this, they can't hear the cue that another actor would hear to do their lines. They are perfectly in sync without having any notion of what has happened to cue them in the environment, right? So they set up different techniques for how to do that, and lots of practice, obviously. I actually interpreted for a woman who ended up becoming the very first deaf cheerleader for the NFL, the Oakland Raiders. And what I would do is, at her audition, I counted out the beat, and then she knew when to start dancing, right? So, so we want to make sure that we understand that anything visual is incredibly important, and accessibility to visual things is incredibly important. Sitting close so people can see, having access to the information and the interpreter is very important. We would never have this kind of a class in the deaf community as a deaf class. Why would that be?
Backs to people.
People can't see each other. So deaf classes tend to be smaller, and they tend to be in a circle. So everyone can see when people are discussing and contributing to the conversation. This second one is, or this next one rather, is one that also is a little tricky for people to wrap their brains around. For members of the deaf community who use American Sign Language, English is a second language. And a second language, and to be frank, a different way than we experience in the spoken language community. Because you may encounter folks who have a different native language, yet exposure to English has either resulted in fluency or some variation thereof, right? Well, Corey was born in California, lived in the United States all his life. Spoken English is never going to come naturally through exposure, right? English in general is never going to come naturally through exposure, because remember, ASL and English are different languages. And there's actually no written form of ASL. So we hear a lot about how deaf kids' reading is so poor. Well, let's think back to what we've talked about. A lot of these kids aren't exposed to what becomes their native language until they're 5 or 6. So think about the language development path that happens there. Then most of the time in the past, through well-intentioned educators, we're trying to teach written language skills in a very similar way. How do you teach a kindergartner to read? What do we say?
Your sounds.
Sound it out. So spoken English is 90% invisible on the lips, right? So you can't use a phonetic approach to teach someone to read. So oftentimes we're trying to use someone who doesn't have a strong language base because of lack of exposure to start with, to learn a second language without accessibility to that language. And so written language skills and even spoken English skills, if someone develops those, are definitely a second language skill. And here's the kicker for folks who, you know, again, well-intentioned hearing folks who develop things like C, signed, exact English. Let me tell you something. C is so different from ASL that if someone's fluent in C and they're signing to me, I'm like, I have no idea what the heck you're talking about. Because it's not conceptual. C is taking English, grammar, and just putting signs on it. So for example, kids I used to work with, they would say things like, hot dog. Well, that's my dog on the porch on a hot day, like he's panting, right? Let's think, language is conceptual, it's symbolic. This is a hot dog, right? So if we are using things like C to teach writing, we don't have a strong language base because there's no language involved in that. It's not conceptual at all. Does that make sense, you guys? As a language researcher, I find that. Anyway. This is another one that's interesting. In deaf culture, oftentimes deaf people identify as a deaf community member first and then as part of another community. In fact, Gallaudet has a huge mural. It like takes up almost one whole wall in the cafeteria. And it shows all of these people, young and old, different colors, purple, yellow, green, white, blue, all colors of the rainbow. And it shows that this huge crowd of people, and there's a boy on one end, and he's going like this for deaf. And there's an adult on the other end, different color, who's going like this, which means we're the same. And so, for example, Corey's best friend is a member of the Jewish community, but he would identify himself as a deaf Jewish man. Because the deafness is a community that it doesn't surpass or doesn't diminish in any way other community memberships, but it is a community that is a very small community that has very strong ties almost immediately. Corey and I were vacationing in Canada one year, and we happened to be in like a bar or something, and these two guys approached us, and they had seen us signing, of course, and one of them turned out to be a deaf man from Austria and his hearing friend from Canada, and they were taking a vacation. And so we started chatting, and you know, within a matter of like an hour, Corey and that guy had figured out a way to teach each other some of their signs from their languages. And this is going to seem so crazy to you guys. It actually does a little bit to me in hindsight, but this is the deaf community. It's so deaf community. So we were renting a townhouse. We were in Tofino, BC, and we had an extra room. And so they came and stayed the night with us and hung out with us all the next day and then went on their way. Like, who invites a stranger from a bar to come stay in your townhouse, right? But that's the way the deaf community is. All right. We've already talked about the notion that people self-identify as deaf or hard of hearing, not hearing impaired. So, you know, I actually can't stand the idea of PC. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around notions of political correctness, but I know that we have been taught that hearing impaired is the right way, or the respectful way to refer to people who have hearing loss. And so I always say this, I'm like waving my magic wand to you all today and releasing you from that obligation, because it's just not. At Gallaudet, people used to have shirts that said, "I'm deaf, I'm not hearing impaired." When I encounter a person with hearing loss, I refer to them just as that, a person with hearing loss, until I know how they culturally self-identify as a person who is hearing impaired or as a member of the deaf community. And again, in our discipline, we talk about person-first language. So when I talk about kids with autism, that just rolls off the tongue. It's a motor pattern for me. Kids with autism. That is not the case, because that, again, is a disability view. Even if, that's why you'll hear people who take a neurodiversity view of autism call themselves an autistic person. Saying, deafness, I'm a deaf person. I'm not a person with deafness. Does that make sense, you guys? It's a cultural perspective. All right. Given a choice, many, if not most, deaf individuals would not become hearing. My friend who's part of the gay community, he said, you know, I wouldn't wake up tomorrow and be straight just because that might afford me more legislative opportunities and more, you know, less discrimination, and maybe reduce some of the challenges that I've experienced as a group who often faces discrimination, because I am who I am. And deaf individuals are exactly the same. If you take a cultural view of deafness, actually that individual I told you about who's in National Theater for the Deaf, or at least he used to be, he actually gave an interview after that movie Sound and the Fury came out. And if you're not familiar with Sound and the Fury, it was about two families kind of decision making around whether their children were going to be implanted with cochlear implants. And so he interviewed afterwards, and he said in the interview, like, would I take a pill tomorrow and wake up and be hearing? Of course not. You know, I am a deaf individual, and that's how I culturally identify. And so I don't view deafness as lack of, or something I need to change, or something I need to fix. It's who I am. All right, so we're going to go super quick through the historical perspective. What time is it, guys? I know we started a little late.
It's 12:38.
Okay, thanks. Oh, till 1:30?
We do have room.
Okay, we might go a little over, but if you have to leave, I'll understand. Historical perspective. So from 1817 to 1860s, that was considered the golden age of deaf education. The American School for the Deaf, which was the very first U.S. school for the deaf, was founded in Hartford, Connecticut by Gallaudet and Laurent Clark. It was followed by many states. So the impetus for this was that a very wealthy and influential businessman at the time had a daughter who was born deaf, and everyone was just sent to institutions at that time, right? And he was like, no, not going to do it. There has to be a better way. So he sent over individuals to Europe to see what people were doing with deaf education in Europe. And Europe has kind of two sides, just like the United States does. There's a very strong oral tradition in places like Great Britain and Germany. And what I mean by oral is that deaf individuals are essentially forced to mainstream and talk and learn how to talk and speech read. Whereas places like Sweden and Norway and France are very much more sign language oriented. And so he went to France and found that Laurent Clark was doing really innovative education for deaf individuals. And he brought him back to the United States. And they started the very first school for the deaf, which is still going. A friend of mine used to work there. And it was the golden age of deaf education because 40% of the teachers were deaf. Okay, that's really key. If you step outside residential schools and you look at deaf education, that rarely happens. And in fact, I remember a friend of mine, when I met them at Gallaudet, so this is a gentleman in his early 20s, and he told me he used to believe that deaf people died when they got older because he had never seen a deaf person who was an adult. So he only saw other kids around him. So the notion that there's adults who are teaching in the same language from the same community is so incredibly important, as we can imagine. In 1864, Gallaudet College was established, and then in 1880 things started to shift. So that was the Congress of Milan, the International Conference on Education of the Deaf. For those of you who don't know, Alexander Graham Bell not only invented the telephone, but he is a strong oralist. And actually he invented the telephone because his wife had hearing loss. And he was trying to figure out, the telephone was an accident, like so many amazing inventions of our time, right? He was actually trying to develop a device to help his wife hear and interact in the hearing community. So the Alexander Graham Bell, the A.G. Bell Association is still strong and kicking today, and it's very much an oralist approach that deaf individuals need to learn to speak and speech read. So AGB was the U.S. delegate. There were no deaf educators at this international conference about deafness. And use in sign language, a result of that was use of sign language in schools was forbidden. Well, here's the thing. When you get people who are visual spatial people together and you forbid them from doing that, they're going to just do it anyway secretly, right? So when Laurent Clark came to the United States, American Sign Language is greatly influenced by French Sign Language. But it wasn't like no one was ever signing before there was a formal mechanism for that. The indigenous sign of the different communities came to form what we know to be ASL. Because it's not like these folks weren't motivated to communicate with each other, right? There just wasn't a formal mechanism for doing so prior to the establishment of ASL. So we're jumping way ahead. 1960, so like 100 years later, folks, William Stokey, who was a linguist, was the very first linguist to identify that ASL is indeed a true language. What does it take to be a language? Dynamics. It has to be a growing, living system that has grammar and semantics and nonverbals and pragmatics, right? And for so long, people had been told in the deaf community that sign language was gestures, was broken English, was second class, essentially. That when William Stokey came out with saying, wait a second, let's look at the development of ASL over time. This is a true language. Even deaf community members were like, wait a second, no, it's not really. No, it's not. And they had to be convinced because they had been told that so much. The TTY was developed by a deaf engineer. So the TTYs actually almost become obsolete. But for a while, that was the only telecommunication means that people had. And it really wasn't available, as I said, to the 1980s. And then they're these little things that look like typewriters, guys. And this is how dated they are, because when I was using them in the 90s, they still had the two balls for putting the phone receiver in. You guys are sometimes way too young. If you see a picture of your grandma's phone ever, it actually used to have a little hearing piece and and a place to talk, and there was something that connected it, right? And it might even had a dial. So TTYs used to have a place to set those things in, and then you would type. And it sounds kind of like a fax machine or Morse code or whatever. It sends what you're typing to the other person. Okay? But these devices were incredibly expensive and not widely available. And if someone else doesn't have a TTY on the other end, forget about it. National Theater for the Deaf was established. The Bilingual Education Act was passed. And that was the act that stated that children who speak another native language need to be taught in that language to use their second language. And this is what we know about bilingual education. Do we just take a child who only speaks one language and then just talk to them back in English? No, we use their native language to teach them English. Yeah, ASL was the only language that was excluded from the Bilingual Education Act. So residential schools, really just in the 90s, started to like say, forget it, I'm not having none of that. And California School for the Deaf Fremont was one of the first ones who took what's called a bilingual, bicultural approach to education. So one of my best friends used to teach at CSD Fremont, and she was a high school English teacher at the deaf school. And she taught Beowulf and Shakespeare and Huck Finn and all of the things that we would expect from a high school English class through ASL, which is, of course, what makes sense. And then these students could take in that information, right? In 1970s, we saw the rise of total communication or signed exact English. So I talked about the notion of SIMCOM when I first started. That's the abbreviation for simultaneous communication. So you may go into a classroom that says they sign, but what actually they're doing is they're talking and they're signing at the same time. So again, we have that same conceptual problem that we had before, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not really sign language. And then PL 94-142 passed. And that's probably the granddaddy of special ed laws. That started everything. And really, that's when mainstreaming became the most important thing. Any child who was identified as having a disability, the intent was to mainstream, and the pendulum swung really hard that way. And so all of these deaf kids were isolated in classrooms with all hearing children, and they were the only deaf kid, and maybe they had an interpreter with them. So 11% of the teachers, it dropped from 40% to 11% of deaf teachers in the school system. In the 1980s, the first closed captioning program was in Boston, developed in Boston. It still isn't widely. You know what? We watch Chopped. My son is like my 6-year-old. He does Chopped competitions with my 9-year-old daughter. Like, he is a Chopped maniac, right? And yeah, we'll pull up Chopped on Demand, which says it's closed captioning, and still today, 2013, it is not captioned. Right? So many things. We ordered the other day, what did we order? Lord of the Rings? Lord of the Rings through Netflix. No captioning. What the heck? Right? Because it may be bothersome. You go into a bar, you see that writing, take that off, whatever. This is the only accessibility. I'll never forget, in DC they have some here, some movie theaters who would show late run movies with captioning. And so, of course, the deaf community was like, boom, there when that happened. And Corey and I went to see Scooby, this is the 90s, but there was a Scooby-Doo, or no, Brady Bunch remake, right? There was like the Brady Bunch, the movie. And so Corey and I went to it, and I was like laughing the entire, Hawaii, Cindy's List, I'm sorry, it was just too much, right? And I'm laughing the entire time. And Corey's kind of like doing a few chuckles, right? And we walk out of the movie, and I said, didn't you think that was awesome? They hit like all of the points. And he goes, I have no idea. When I would watch the Brady Bunch when I was a kid, I just made up what was happening. Right? All right. So in the 1980s, we finally had the first sign language books by actual deaf authors. The cochlear implant was developed. Marlene Matlin won the Academy Award. And the deaf community was actually kind of upset with her. Because here she does this. Well, first of all, what's the name of that movie?
Children of a Lesser God.
Thank you. Children of a Lesser God. Not the best representation. I mean, William Hurt, and I love him. His signing, horrible. But having said that, so here's this deaf woman who wins the Academy Award. Awesome. She's completely like this strong, independent deaf woman in the movie. And what does she do? She goes and stands on the stage and she speaks. Right? So that was upsetting to members of the deaf community because it's just like, wait a second, you've just shown that you identify as the deaf culture person in this movie and you're strong and proud of your language, and then you go to this award ceremony and you feel compelled that you have to use the majority language. The Congressional Report Towards Equality recommended use of ASL and English as a second language, so that bicultural, bilingual approach, yet it's still not happening. At the time, so this was mid-90s, my friend went to Maryland School for the Deaf for one of her internships, and they would have spoken English days where the kids weren't allowed to sign at all. What? I don't, like, okay, you guys can't talk all day long. Don't do it. It's not allowed. Probably the most significant event in deaf history was Deaf President Now. And this just happened in 1988. And that may seem like a long time ago for some of you, but if we think about, this is the March on Washington, MLK's March on Washington for the deaf community. So what happened is that the board of directors of Gallaudet went to appoint a new president. And actually they picked the person who eventually became the president of the University of Idaho. I don't know if she's still there. She didn't know a lick of sign language. She was like me, entering Gallaudet, and never met a deaf person before. And she's going to be the president of the only deaf university. Okay? So there was completely a protest. The students were like, had enough. The faculty were like, had enough. They locked the doors of Gallaudet. They marched on Washington. This is them at the Capitol building. And it's called DPN, Deaf President Now. And they're like, enough. The head of the Regents Board is quoted as saying, deaf people are not ready to function in a hearing world. And so really this patriarchal, we'll take care of you, you can't do it on your own. And the deaf community was like, enough, I'm not going to do it, I don't accept that. And so they made 5 demands. A deaf president, that 50% of the regions, 51% of the Regents Board from then on had to include deaf members. 51%. I said 50. I corrected myself. There would be no repercussions for the faculty and the deaf students who took part in Deaf President Now. Oh boy. Tell me. What are the last 2?
Oh, I don't remember. Sorry.
I should have reviewed that. And they won.
Well, and the president of the board that stuff now.
Yes, thank you so much. Resignation of Jane Spillman, who didn't think that deaf people could take care of themselves. Yes, and there was one more. And they won. And they won. And they achieved their goals after closing down the university for 5 days. And here's the celebration. That's a picture of the main building when you go into Gallaudet. Deaf people clap with their hands like this, so everyone was clapping. That's what this picture is. All right. 1990s. By 93, more deafness-related legislation had passed in the 5 years since Deaf President Now than in the previous 250 years. That's what I mean by DPN being the civil rights movement for the deaf community. Okay? ADA is tricky. Deaf people were stuck because they absolutely don't identify as a disability group. But let's face it, things like accessibility in terms of communication, accessibility here in a university setting, having the ability to use their language, they had to take advantage of legislation that viewed them as a disability group, okay? Because otherwise there was no equal access to what it is that we all take advantage of every day, which is being able to watch TV, being able to have a lecture at college, being able to have a way to communicate with folks. You know, we both have cell phones now where we text, but for the longest time, if you wanted to see your deaf friend, you went to their house and you hung out. You know, we would come home sometimes and someone had been waiting for us for like 30, 45 minutes. You would have a house that had big windows. And oftentimes you left your door unlocked. And people would just come in. Because we didn't have things like blinking lights for doorbells. And you know, some kind of indicator when someone was knocking at your door. If you wanted to get together, you wrote a letter to your friend. Wrote a letter. Imagine that. So you can see why email and texting has become very great. Caption devices were required in TVs over 13 inches. IDEA came about. That's the predecessor of, help me guys. What do we have now? No Child Left Behind, thank you. I block it out. Residential schools are labeled the most restrictive environment for deaf children. Most restrictive environment for deaf children. I don't really have much to say about that. Miss America was Heather Whitestone. She actually came to Gallaudet when I was there. She didn't know sign very well. I have to say, unfortunately, she wasn't very well received. Because her mom went on, you know, with Tom Brokaw saying, I never gave up. I wasn't going to accept that she was deaf. You know, I pushed her, and it was just like she was this hero for forcing her deaf child to learn spoken English, right? Because she never gave up on her child with disabilities. So, cochlear implant use increased. It was approved by the FDA without any deaf individuals being included on the committee. 2000s to present. So the North Carolina Secretary of Education, that happened probably about 5 years ago, went over to Europe, saw most of the oral programs there, was incredibly impressed, and came back and tried to close down the North Carolina School for the Deaf. And he was quoted as saying, not teaching deaf children to speak is labeled as child abuse. Should be labeled as child abuse. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about speaking. I took French and Spanish as minors in my undergraduate. I was actually an international business major many moons ago. So when I wrote my resume back in those days, at the bottom under skills I would write French, I used to be fluent, Spanish, pretty fluent, because those are skills. Speaking is exactly that in the deaf community. One of our closest friends, she works at a major healthcare corporation, has a very high administrative job, and when she goes to work, she uses spoken English skills, and she uses amplification with one person or more. If there's more than that, you need an interpreter in the group. She goes home to her deaf husband, who doesn't use spoken English, who doesn't speech read or use amplification, takes her hearing aid off, signs with her 2 children who sign, 3 actually now, and is a deaf community member because spoken English is another skill that she has, that she uses in her workplace. Her husband, who actually also works in the same company and is like a brilliant financial person, doesn't speech read, he doesn't speak, and I'm a hearing person too, so I'm not trying to like be bad about a hearing